Books on Tape presents Letter from Home by Carolyn Hart. Read by Kate Redding. Dear Gretchen, you're rich and famous now. You've been all over the world, seen things I'll never see, met people I'll never know. I saw you once on TV going to a big night at the Kennedy Center. You had on a white satin gown, and it looked like a diamond necklace around your throat. That was a handsome man with you. Chapter 1. The rusted iron gate sagged from the stone pillar. A winter-brown vine clung to the stones. Pale March sunlight filtered through the bare branches of sycamores and oaks, throwing thin black shadows as distinct as stylized brushwork in a Japanese painting. My cane poked through a mound of tawny leaves, some wizened and wrinkled as old faces, some damp and soggy, smelling of must and rot and decay. The rutted road looked much narrower than I remembered. When I'd last been in the cemetery, most of the headstones, even those dating back to Indian Territory days, had stood straight. Now many were tilted, and some had tumbled to the ground, half hidden by leaves. Remnants of a late snow spangled shaded spots. I walked slowly, stabbing my cane at the uneven ground. Nothing looked familiar. Our graves were surely this way. Oh, of course, the weeping willow was gone. I'd always marked our family plot by a huge willow, its dangling fronds shiny green in summer, bare and brown in winter. A stump leaned crookedly near the plot. I paused to rest for a moment. The sharp wind rustled the bare branches of the sycamores and oaks. I shivered, grateful for the warmth of my cashmere coat and leather gloves. I plunged my left hand into a pocket of my coat. My gloved fingers closed around the letter. The name on the return address had not been familiar, but I had recognized the postmark. My first thought when I received the square cream envelope had been as instinctive as breathing. Why, it's a letter from home. Second came a quiver of utter surprise. Home? I'd not been back to the little town in northeastern Oklahoma since I was a girl. Home. When I opened the envelope and lifted out 3 pages, cheap paper with violently colored roses twining down one side, the writing a dense, almost indecipherable scrawl, I almost threw the sheets away unread. The salutation stopped me. Dear Gretchen. No one had called me Gretchen for well over a half-century. Gretchen. Across a span of time, I remembered a girl, dark-haired, blue-eyed, slim and eager, who seemed quite separate and distinct from the old woman walking determinedly toward the graves. I remembered that long-ago girl. Gretchen clutched the folded sheaf of yellow copy paper and a thick, dark-leaded pencil, sharp enough for writing, but the point too blunt to break. That was just how Mr. Dennis did it when he covered the city council. Her first day at the Gazette, he'd waggled a thick handful of copy paper. "This is all you need, Gretchen. Take some paper and a couple of pencils, listen hard, make notes you can read, write your story fast." It still seemed strange to walk toward Victory Cafe and not hurry inside, welcoming the familiar smells of cinnamon rolls and coffee and bacon. Victory Cafe. She was almost used to the name now. It used to be Pfizer Cafe, but after Pearl Harbor, when people began to talk about Nazis and Krauts as well as the Japs, Grandmother hired Elwyn Haskins to paint a new name in bright red and blue against a white background. Victory Cafe. There was a small American flag near the cash register, and the mirror behind the counter held pictures of men in the service. Anyone could bring a photo, and Grandmother would tape it up. Now people were beginning to believe in victory, especially since the invasion, though it seemed that the convoys rolling through on Highway 66 were longer than ever, and the trains clacking past day and night pulled more and more flat cars carrying tanks and trucks and jeeps. Sometimes soldiers leaned from open windows and waved. Gretchen stopped for the red light at Broadway and Main. She waited impatiently. The light was new, and lots of people honked their horns at it when they had to stop. There'd been a big fight in City Council about putting in a stoplight. Mayor Burkett got his way, insisting their town needed the light. After all, he'd pointed out, everything was different because of the war, and they had plenty of traffic, people stopping off from Highway 66, and soldiers coming over the Missouri line from Camp Crowder, and local folks streaming into town to buy whatever shopkeepers had to offer. There were lots of people in town every day, but most of them were old or middle-aged. The young men in uniform were never there for long, off for 3-day passes and sometimes 10-day furloughs before their units were set to ship out. There wasn't much to buy, but people had money from war work. Lots of townspeople like Gretchen's mom had gone to Tulsa to work in the Douglas plant. Mom was making good money, more than they'd ever seen, $35 a week. The Billop shoe store had closed. Mr. Billop couldn't get enough shoes. Most everybody had to depend upon friends or family to find shoes at Frug's or Brown Duncan in Tulsa, and rationing only allowed 2 pairs a year anyway. Mr. Pinkley's gas station went out of business, but there was a motel, Sweet Dreams, on the edge of town, and some new little houses built from lumber salvaged from old barns and the abandoned Morris house. Mr. McCrory's gas station was going great guns despite rationing. He specialized in repairs, and everybody needed to keep their old cars running for the duration. When the light changed, Gretchen hurried across the street. She wanted to run, but she held herself to a fast walk. She, Gretchen Grace Gilman, was on her way to the courthouse, the big red sandstone building that looked like a castle with bays and turrets. When she was little, she'd made up a story in her mind about a princess held captive in a turret, and a handsome swashbuckler like Errol Flynn leaping ledge to ledge, sword in hand, coming to the rescue of the fair maiden. That had been exciting, but nothing to compare to the excitement she felt now. The courthouse was her beat, and so was City Hall on Cimarron Street. Of course, Mr. Dennis or Mr. Cooley covered the big stories, but there was plenty for Gretchen to write about. She'd been to both the courthouse and City Hall first thing this morning, checked the sheriff's office for any overnight calls, asked the court clerk about lawsuits, dropped by the county records office to see about deeds registered, and scanned the police blotter at the police station. This was her last run to the courthouse and City Hall for the day. She'd already turned in her stories for today's paper. Last deadline was 1 o'clock, but that was for late-breaking news, wire stories from the war front, especially the fighting in Normandy. Ever since D-Day, they'd had a map on page 1 showing the progress of the fighting. Most of her stories were turned in by 10. The press run was at 2. She glanced across Main at the cafe. The windows needed a wash. Mrs. Perkins did a pretty good job, but she couldn't, or wouldn't, move as fast as Gretchen, and she didn't help Grandmother the way Gretchen did when she worked there. That's how Gretchen had expected to spend the summer until the miracle happened. Mrs. Jacobs, the junior high English teacher, telling Mr. Dennis that Gretchen wanted to grow up and be a reporter, and that she'd make a good hand while the Gazette was so short-staffed because of the war. Mrs. Jacobs told Gretchen to go ask for a job when Joe Bob Terrell was drafted. Gretchen had put on her favorite dress, a yellow and white check dirndl with starfish appliques at the shoulder and near the hem, and white rickrack as an accent at the neck, waist, and skirt, and pulled on short white gloves and a yellow straw hat. She didn't have any good summer shoes, but she'd taken her white sandals and polished them, and hoped Mr. Dennis wouldn't notice that the straps were frayed. She'd never forget, never in 1,000 million years, that May afternoon. School was almost out, and Mrs. Jacobs got her excused from last hour. It was only May, but it was hot, the temperature nudging toward 90. Everybody said it was going to be a hot summer, the summer of 1944. But Gretchen didn't remember any summers when it hadn't been hot and dry, and sometimes the wind blew dust through town, coating the buildings, turning the sky a smudgy orange. At the cafe they'd wipe everything with a damp cloth, but it was hard to keep the dust out of the booths and off the tables and chairs, and they'd come home to a house with a fine layer of dust on everything. It wasn't dusty that May afternoon. The sky glittered a sharp, bright, clear blue, and she'd held tight to her hat as the Oklahoma wind gusted, bending the trees, skittering trash down the street. When she got to the Gazette office, she'd stared at the door and been so scared she'd almost turned and run away. Could she do it? She was editor of the Wolf Cry, the junior high newspaper. Mrs. Jacobs liked her stories, had given her bylines all this past year. One story, the one about Millard, Mrs. Jacobs sent in to the interscholastic contest. When Gretchen won first prize, she'd felt funny, happy and sad at the same time. But Millard would have been proud for her. Mrs. Jacobs had told Gretchen to cut out all her stories and take them to show Mr. Dennis.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?